Greenbrier County, West Virginia, 43 acres of hollow that the Alleghenies forgot. Fog clings to the ridgeline like a secret the mountains refuse to let go. Below a farmhouse, Victorian bones, 3 gables, paint peeling from the clapboards like skin from a wound that never healed. The porch sags. The windows are dark. A sign at the entrance reads, "Cursed land. Keep out." A rust-spotted Honda turns onto the gravel track. Inside, a woman grips a deed with white knuckles. In the back seat, 2 boys share a single blanket. One of them is struggling to breathe. She has $400, no running water, no electricity, and 30 days before the county takes her children. But beneath this dirt, beneath the limestone, beneath the clay, beneath everything everyone told her was worthless, something has been waiting for 40 years for exactly this woman. The engine dies. She doesn't move, not yet. $400.37. That was the sum total of everything Lenora Whitfield had left after 11 years of marriage to a man who kept score. $400, 2 boys who still believed in her, and a deed to 43 acres of land the county assessor had described without a trace of irony as geologically unfortunate. The courthouse steps in Louisburg groaned beneath her sneakers as October rain drove sideways across the Greenbrier Valley, soaking through a jacket too thin for the season, too thin for the mountains, too thin for any of this. But Nora barely registered the cold. Her fingers were busy protecting the deed inside her coat, pressing it flat against her ribs, as if the document might dissolve in the rain and take her last option with it. Somewhere in that courthouse behind her, a clerk was already filing the transfer paperwork. Somewhere in a glass office tower in Charleston, her ex-husband was already composing the text message she'd receive before she reached the car. And somewhere in the fog-wrapped hills east of town, 43 acres of what locals call the Devil's Backbone sat waiting for a woman who had no business owning it and no choice but to try. If you've ever had to bet everything on a piece of ground nobody else wanted, you already know what happens next. And if you haven't, stay with us, because what Lenora Whitfield found beneath that cursed soil would be worth $130 million. But the price of finding it nearly cost her the only thing money can't replace. Before we begin, if stories like this move, you consider subscribing. It costs nothing, and it means we can keep telling them. The rain fell harder. Nora's phone buzzed against her hip as she crossed the courthouse parking lot. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Dalton had a sixth sense for moments when she was most vulnerable, a radar honed across 11 years of marriage and 18 months of divorce proceedings that had stripped her down to bone and sinew. She looked anyway, classic Nora, buying a dirt pile. The boys deserve better than your geology fantasies. She read it twice, not because the words were complicated, but because they still had the power to reach inside her chest and squeeze. Dalton Whitfield had a gift for that sentences that sounded reasonable on the surface, but carried razors in their grammar. The boys deserve better. Not our boys. Not we should discuss this. The boys deserve better. As if she were a weather pattern the children needed shelter from, rather than the woman who'd nursed them through every fever, every nightmare, every asthma attack at 3 in the morning, while Dalton slept undisturbed in the guest bedroom he'd started using after their 7th anniversary. She deleted the message without replying and folded herself into the rust-spotted Honda Civic parked at the far end of the lot. The back seat was a geography of displacement suitcases wedged between cardboard boxes, a laundry basket filled with winter coats, a plastic bin containing everything from the bathroom medicine cabinet. 2 boys occupied whatever space remained. Silas sat with his knees drawn up, a library book balanced on top of them. His breathing carried a faint wheeze, barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof, but Nora's ears were tuned to that frequency the way a musician's ears are tuned to a wrong note in an orchestra. The inhaler in his backpack was nearly empty, 3, maybe 4 doses left. The prescription refill would cost $62 she could not spare. Beckett older by 9 minutes and a lifetime of self-appointed responsibility had his arm resting across his brother's shoulders. Not protectively exactly, more like an engineer's hand on a load-bearing wall, monitoring for structural failure. "Where are we going, Mama?" Beckett's voice carried no complaint, just logistics. He'd been asking logistical questions since the day Nora set both boys down in the kitchen of their old house in Charleston, and explained with a steadiness she did not feel that she and their father would be living in different places now. Silas had cried. Beckett had asked where they'd keep the Christmas ornaments. "We're going home, to our farm." Silas lowered his book. "We have a farm. We do now, 43 acres. Dad says it's just dirt." The words landed in the car like something thrown. Nora's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel, not from anger at her younger son, but from the recognition of how completely Dalton's voice had colonized even the vocabulary of a 10-year-old. "Your father doesn't know everything about dirt. I do. That's what I went to school for, remember. And this particular dirt has water underneath it. I can feel it in the geology. Where there's water, there's life. That's the rule." She caught Beckett's eyes in the rearview mirror. He was studying her face with an expression no child should have to learn, the expression of someone assessing whether an adult was telling the truth or performing it. She held his gaze until he looked away first. The engine caught on the 3rd try. They drove east out of Louisburg on Route 60, the road narrowing as civilization gave way to the Alleghenies. Strip malls yielded to feed stores to churches, churches to nothing but the road itself, winding through hollows where the fog pulled thick as cotton. The boys fell asleep somewhere past Caldwell, their breathing synchronizing the way twins' breathing does, one body distributed across 2 frames. Nora's mind worked ahead of the headlights. How long could she stretch their food supply? 4 days, maybe 5. If she supplemented the canned goods with whatever Betty Crocker ingenuity she could summon from a kitchen she hadn't yet seen. How far was the nearest school? 15 miles, according to the county clerk, who'd processed the deed. And the nearest doctor for Silas she didn't know, hadn't thought to ask, hadn't wanted to add another impossible variable to an equation already unsolvable by any conventional math. 20 minutes from the property, Silas's breathing changed. The wheeze deepened into something wet, a sound like air being pulled through a damp cloth. Nora's eyes snapped to the mirror. Beckett was already awake, already reaching for his brother's backpack, already unzipping the front pocket where the inhaler lived. It had rolled out, somewhere between the last gas station and the Greenbrier County line. It had tumbled free and lodged beneath the passenger seat. Nora pulled onto the shoulder so fast the gravel sprayed, wrenched her body sideways, and groped under the seat until her finger closed around the plastic cylinder. She pressed it into Silas's small hands. 2 puffs, the hiss of medication entering desperate lungs, the slow, agonizing retreat of the wheeze as the bronchodilator fought back against constricted airways. Silas sat pale and drained afterward, his chest rising and falling with deliberate effort. Beckett hadn't moved his arm from his brother's shoulders. His face was a mask of practiced calm that broke Nora's heart more thoroughly than any wheeze ever could. Not enough doses to last the week. She swallowed and pulled back onto the road. The turnoff appeared without warning. A gravel track nearly swallowed by rhododendron and mountain laurel, invisible unless you knew to look for the gap between 2 massive hemlocks. A wooden sign dangled from a single rusted chain. Hargrove Hollow, established 1889. Someone had spray-painted across it in fading red letters, "Cursed land, keep out." Nora turned onto the track. The Honda bottomed out twice on ruts deep enough to swallow a tire. Branches scraped both sides of the car like fingernails dragging across a coffin lid. The driveway stretched nearly half a mile, curving through stands of red oak and sugar maple, so thick the canopy blocked what remained of the afternoon light. Then the trees fell away, and the Hargrove farmhouse appeared. Victorian bones, wrap-around porch, 3 gables reaching toward a sky that seemed lower here, pressed down by the surrounding ridgelines. It must have been something once the house of a woman with means and taste and the stubbornness to build in a hollow where building made no practical sense. But time and vacancy had performed their surgery. Paint peeled from the clapboards like diseased skin. 2 upstairs windows gaped open, covered with plastic sheeting that had torn loose and now flapped in the wind like surrender flags. The roof sagged in one corner where water damage had eaten through the underlayment. A section of porch railing had collapsed entirely, its broken spindles scattered in the weeds below like teeth knocked from a jaw. "Mom?" Beckett's voice was quiet, not accusatory. Worse, it was careful. "It's falling apart." "It needs work," Nora conceded. "But the bones are good." Look at the foundation. Those are hand-cut limestone blocks. They don't build like that anymore. And look at all this space." She gestured toward the overgrown field stretching behind the house, the distant tree line marking the property boundary against the ridge line, the cluster of outbuildings, a barn weathered to the color of old blood, several sheds, what might have been a root cellar covered in kudzu, all damaged, all standing. Late afternoon sun broke through the cloud cover and lit the hollow with the kind of golden light that makes even ruin look like possibility. A hawk circled above the eastern field, riding a thermal with absolute confidence in the air beneath its wings. Silas pressed his face against the car window. "Is that our barn?" "It is." "Can we have animals?" Nora's throat constricted. "We'll see, Bud. First things first." She parked beside the porch steps. For a moment, none of them moved. The magnitude of what lay ahead filled the Honda like floodwater rising past their ankles, their knees, their chests. Then Beckett reached for the door handle. "I'll start carrying stuff in." The brass skeleton key from the county office slid into the front door lock with a satisfying weight. It turned with a solid clunk, the mechanism still functional, still loyal to its purpose after decades of disuse. Unlike almost everything else on the property, the door swung inward on hinges that protested like old men rising from church pews. The foyer smelled of abandonment, dust mildew, the stale exhalation of rooms that hadn't drawn fresh breath in 30 years, but beneath that cedar, old wood, the skeleton of a house that had been built to outlast its occupants. A central staircase rose before them, its banister still elegant under a thick fur of dust. To the left, a parlor with a stone fireplace blackened by decades of use. To the right, a dining room where a crystal chandelier hung at a precarious angle, refracting the weak light into small rainbows that drifted across the peeling wallpaper. Silas sneezed 3 times. The sound ricocheted off empty walls like small-caliber gunfire. The kitchen was a museum of the 1970s. Avocado green appliances, cracked laminate countertops, cabinet doors hanging at angles that suggested the hinges had given up long before the occupants had. A heavy oak table dominated the center, its surface buried under fallen ceiling plaster. But the bones were good. Deep farmhouse sink, wide plank floors, windows that framed the eastern field like paintings nobody had looked at in 40 years. "Does the electricity work?" Beckett flipped a switch. "Nothing. We'll check the breaker box tomorrow. Tonight we've got flashlights and the camping lantern." They explored the first floor room by room, each space revealing its own archaeology of neglect. A small study of the kitchen, its wall lined with empty bookshelves. A bathroom with fixtures stained the color of old tea. When Nora turned the faucet, the pipes groaned a long, anguished sound, but delivered nothing. "Well, pump must be dead," she murmured. Upstairs, 4 bedrooms. The master with an attached bath. 3 smaller rooms connected by a central hallway with a window at each end. The largest bedroom still contained twin beds, their mattresses stripped and covered in plastic sheeting. Silas immediately claimed them. "Can this be ours, mine, and Beck's, sir?" Nora nodded, watching Beckett test the mattress with one cautious hand. Dust rose in a cloud that caught the last daylight from the window, each mote spinning slowly, suspended between falling and flying. She focused the remaining light on creating one habitable space. Master bedroom, clean sheets from the suitcase, the camping lantern positioned on the windowsill, sleeping bags unrolled across the mattress for extra warmth. The boys helped carry essentials from the car, the cooler with sandwich supplies, bottled water, the first aid kit that served as their pharmacy, now that Nora's insurance had evaporated along with the marriage. Their first dinner was peanut butter sandwiches eaten cross-legged on the bedroom floor, the camping lantern casting shadows that transformed the peeling wallpaper into something that looked, if you squinted, almost like a mural. "It's like camping," Silas offered. "But inside?" Beckett chewed without comment. His eyes tracked the ceiling, cataloging the water stains, the cracks in the plaster, the places where the structure revealed its exhaustion. After a while he spoke. "We can fix this, right, Mom? We can fix this." She wasn't sure she believed it, but she was sure she needed them to believe it, and sometimes that's enough to keep a thing alive until it becomes true. The boys fell asleep, pressed against her, on both sides, their warmth the only reliable heating system in the house. Nora lay awake. The house creaked and settled around them, each sound amplified by the darkness and the silence of a hollow where the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and the nearest street light might as well have been on the moon. Wind found every gap in the aging structure, producing sounds that were not quite whistles and not quite words, but occupied the unsettling space between. Rain returned before dawn, a steady percussion on the roof, punctuated by the distinct plink of water hitting something that wasn't supposed to be wet. Nora tracked the sound to a corner of the bedroom, where a stain was spreading across the ceiling like a bruise developing in real time. She positioned their empty cooler beneath the drip and added roof to the list of impossibilities accumulating in her mind. Morning light was merciless. It entered through grimy windows and illuminated every failure the darkness had concealed. The fields were choked with thistle and blackberry bramble. Fence lines sagged into the weeds. The barn's paint had weathered to a pink, so faded it was almost an apology for color. But Nora's trained eye, the eye Dalton had dismissed as impractical, the eye she'd been told to close when she left the research position he'd pressured her to quit, that ISO past the surface decay, the contours of the land, the exposure patterns of the native vegetation, the limestone outcropping visible at the far eastern edge of the property, its layered face speaking a geological language she hadn't read in years but hadn't forgotten. Karst topography, sinkholes, caves, underground drainage systems that explained why surface water never lasted here, but also suggested to someone who understood the grammar of stone that deeper reserves might exist. People didn't build homesteads where water couldn't be found. Odette Hargrove, had known this land secret. Nora just needed to rediscover it. While the boys explored the yard, Silas finding an ancient tire swing, Beckett testing the structural integrity of the porch railing with kicks that sent it shuddering, Nora investigated the kitchen more thoroughly. The refrigerator was a lost cause, its interior a terrarium of mold. The gas stove might work with a propane refill. She opened drawers filled with utensils from another era cabinets containing dishes so dusty they looked fossilized. In the back of the third drawer, she tried her fingers, found something that didn't belong with the butter knives and the bent whisks. A sealed envelope yellowed to the color of old ivory, the paper thick and expensive. Across the front, in handwriting so precise it looked almost engraved, "For the new family." Nora's pulse quickened. She broke the seal, carefully unfolded the letter inside, and read. To whoever finds this letter, the land has secrets, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that heal if you're willing to listen. The well may have failed, but water waits below. Trust the old ways, trust your training, trust each other. This hollow has been called cursed, but only by those who refuse to look closely enough. What lies beneath is more precious than what grows above. My research was dismissed. My findings were mocked. But time is patient, and so is stone. Look for my work in the cellar beneath this kitchen. The entrance is beneath the pantry floor. There you'll find the truth and the way forward. Odette Hargrove. She read it twice more. Then she noticed what had been tucked inside the envelope alongside the letter, a small brass instrument, heavy for its size, warm from decades of waiting. A pocket loop, the kind geologists carry in the field, its lens still clear beneath a patina of age. Initials were scratched into the brass casing. Och! Nora held the loop to her eye. Through its magnification, the kitchen table surface transformed what looked like ordinary wood grain, became a landscape of ridges and valleys, a topography invisible to the naked eye. She lowered it slowly. The letter's last line echoed the truth and the way forward. The pantry was a narrow room off the kitchen, its shelves bare, its floor worn smooth by decades of foot traffic that had ended abruptly sometime in the late 1970s. Nora knelt and examined the planks. After several minutes, she found it a rectangular seam, slightly darker than the surrounding wood, invisible unless you were on your knees and looking, no handle. But when she pressed firmly on one edge, the opposite side lifted with the whisper of a counterweight mechanism. "Mom," Beckett's voice from the kitchen doorway, "what are you doing on the floor?" I found something, grabbed the flashlight from my backpack. Moments later, with both boys crowding the narrow staircase behind her, Nora descended into Odette Hargrove's hidden cellar. The flashlight beam cut through air that tasted of earth and patience and secrets kept so long they'd become geological features of their own. The space below was nothing like the neglected farmhouse above. Metal shelving units lined the wall, each shelf holding labeled rock and soil samples, arranged with the precision of a library card catalogue. A drafting table dominated the center, its surface protected by clear plastic over maps and diagrams covered in handwritten annotations. Equipment stood positioned around the room with obvious purpose, a seismograph core sampling tools, something that looked like a ground-penetrating radar unit. All of it at least 40 years old, all of it clearly once state-of-the-art. This wasn't a root cellar, it was a research station. Nora moved through the space with professional reverence, her flashlight lingering on details that told a story no one above ground had ever heard. The maps showed detailed subsurface surveys of the property, soil composition analyses, seismic readings plotted on grid paper with the obsessive care of someone who understood that truth lived in data, in opinions. One area near the eastern boundary, the same direction as the limestone outcropping she'd noticed that morning, was circled repeatedly in red ink. Beside it, in Odette's precise handwriting, kimberlite. Nora's breath stopped in her lungs. Kimberlite, the volcanic rock formation that serves as an elevator shaft for diamonds, carrying them from the crushing depths of the Earth's mantle to within reach of the surface. The word alone was enough to make any geologist's hands tremble, because kimberlite pipes were vanishingly rare, and the ones that actually contained commercial-grade diamonds were rarer still. "What is all this stuff?" Silas touched the seismograph with the careful finger of a boy who understood that some things demanded respect. "Scientific equipment for studying what's underground." Beckett picked up a labeled rock sample, turning it in the flashlight beam. "Is this what the letter meant about secrets?" Nora forced herself to breathe. The professional in her wanted to spend days down here, cataloging Odette's work, verifying her methodology, testing her conclusions. But the mother in her, the mother who had 3 doses of asthma medication left, and no money to buy more, knew that some secrets needed to stay secret until the right moment. "Let's go back upstairs. We can explore more later." She slipped the brass loop into her pocket. Its weight settled against her thigh like a promise. They had barely returned to the kitchen when the crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Nora moved to the front window. A red pickup truck, its paint faded to the color of dried clay, had pulled into the driveway. An elderly man was climbing out, tall, slightly stooped, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone that lined the hollow, silver hair beneath a feed store cap, flannel shirt, work boots that had never been decorative. Nora stepped onto the porch as the stranger approached. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his pale eyes performing a single, comprehensive sweep of the property, the woman and the 2 boys now flanking her like sentries. "You must be the new owner. I'm Clement Driscoll. My wife Fay and I have the farm adjoining yours to the north, half-mile through those hemlocks." Nora introduced herself and the twins. Clement shook hands with each boy, a formal gesture that seemed to belong to an earlier decade, his expression softening slightly at Silas's polite murmur and Beckett's firm grip. You know what you've gotten yourself into. Clement's gaze returned to the farmhouse, lingered on the sagging roof, the broken railing, the general atmosphere of surrender. I know it needs work. Clement shook his head, not talking about the repairs, though Lord knows those'll keep you busy through Easter. I'm talking about this land itself. There's a reason the county practically gave it away. Nobody's farmed this hollow successfully in 30 years. Soil won't hold water. Old-timers call it the Hargrove curse. Nora's fingers found the loop in her pocket. What lies beneath is more precious than what grows above. I've heard the stories, but I'm trained in geology. I have some ideas about the water situation that might change things. Clement's eyebrows rose. A flicker of something crossed his face. Not surprise exactly. Something more complicated. Something that might have been recognition. You're a geologist. Was before marriage, before kids. But stone doesn't change, and neither does what I know about it. He studied her for a long moment. Whatever calculation was happening behind those weathered eyes, it concluded with a single nod. Faye sent me with this. He returned to the truck and came back, carrying a covered casserole dish in one hand and a propane canister in the other. Casserole'll save you cooking tonight. Canister should fit that old stove if you want hot water. Previous folks left it when they cleared out. Faye's got notions about feeding people. Nora blinked against the sting in her eyes. The kindness was almost harder to absorb than the hardship. That's incredibly generous. Thank you. As Clement returned to his truck for the canister, a second vehicle materialized on the driveway, sleek, black. An SUV so polished it reflected the surrounding mountains in its doors like a dark mirror. It parked behind Clement's truck with the precision of someone accustomed to taking the best space in any lot. The woman who emerged wore a pantsuit the color of charcoal, a clipboard clutched against her chest like body armor. Her heels, impractical for gravel, sank slightly with each step, creating tiny divots that would fill with rain by nightfall. Lenora Whitfield. The professional smile was a masterwork of insincerity. I'm Vivian Tate, Monroe, County Child Protective Services. We received a report expressing concern about the welfare of 2 minors recently relocated to this address. Nora's stomach plunged. She didn't need to ask who had filed the report. Dalton's strategy was revealing itself with the clarity of a chess game played by someone who'd already decided on the endgame before moving the first pawn. The inspection was surgical. Vivian Tate documented every hazard with the dispassionate thoroughness of someone building a case rather than assessing a home. The leaking roof photographed, the non-functional water system noted, the broken windows catalogued, the absence of functioning smoke detectors, the questionable wiring, the collapsed porch railing all entered into her clipboard's growing inventory of failure. She asked questions calibrated to expose vulnerability, schooling arrangements in progress, healthcare access being researched, financial resources. Nora heard herself delivering answers that sounded even to her own ears like someone narrating a controlled demolition from inside the building. The boys watched from the porch. Clement stood nearby, his presence a silent counterweight to the bureaucratic invasion, though his authority extended no further than moral support and the casserole cooling on the railing. Vivian Tate closed her notebook with a sound like a verdict. Miss Whitfield, this property is currently unsuitable for children. You have 30 days to address the critical safety deficiencies: functioning water system, approved septic, electrical inspection, roof repair, secure windows and doors. If these matters aren't resolved, we'll recommend temporary placement for Silas and Beckett while you secure appropriate housing. The words hung in the hollow like the fog that would settle there at nightfall. Temporary placement, a bureaucratic euphemism for taking her children. Nora accepted the violation notice. The items blurred before her eyes. Each repair carried a cost that exceeded her total resources several times over. The water system alone drilling a new well or rehabilitating the collapsed one would consume everything and then some. Vivian departed in a spray of gravel and the scent of department store perfume. The hollow absorbed her absence the way it absorbed everything slowly, completely, without comment. Clement cleared his throat. 30 days isn't much. Nora stared at the violation papers. No. He glanced at the twins who were pretending to examine the tire swing while staying within earshot of every word. Maybe I can help with some of it. Got tools, got know-how, won't fix everything but might make a start. Before Nora could respond, a third vehicle appeared on the driveway. Not a truck, not an SUV, a Range Rover black as a judge's robe, with tinted windows and chrome detailing that caught the dying afternoon light and threw it back in sharp splinters. Clement's entire body changed. The helpful neighbor who'd been leaning comfortably against his truck straightened as if someone had run a current through his spine. His jaw set, his eyes narrowed. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, the posture of a man who had seen something he recognized and did not welcome. The driver emerged, tall, silver-haired, a suit that fit his body the way expensive suits do, not merely covering but sculpting, suggesting a physique maintained by personal trainers and the kind of discipline that comes from believing one's appearance is a form of authority. His shoes alone probably cost more than the Honda Civic cooling in the driveway. "Miss Whitfield, I presume." The smile revealed teeth too perfect to have occurred naturally. "Mercer Stanhope. I own Stanhope Coal and Mineral. Welcome to Greenbrier County." His gaze swept the property, the farmhouse, the patched roof, the boys on the porch, with the appraising efficiency of someone calculating square footage and mineral rights simultaneously. "I heard the Hargrove place finally sold. I've had my eye on this property for years, but the county insisted on the auction process. Smart move, waiting them out." The assumption embedded in his words that Nora had employed strategy rather than desperation went uncorrected. She watched Clement watching Stanhope. Whatever history existed between the two men, it had compressed itself into the kind of silence that carries more weight than speech. "Mercer?" Clement's greeting contained no warmth. "Bit far from your office?" "Just being neighborly, Clement." Stanhope's smile held. His eyes cooled. "Thought I'd see if Miss Whitfield needs anything. My company has considerable resources that might benefit someone taking on such a challenging property." The pause before challenging was deliberate. A salesman's pause designed to let the listener fill the silence with their own doubt. "If you're finding the project overwhelming, and who wouldn't, I'd be happy to take the property off your hands, $25,000. He produced an envelope from his interior pocket. "Far more than the purchase price, and without the headache of repairs you can't afford. $25,000. Enough for a modest apartment, school enrollment, Silas's medication for 2 years, a fresh start somewhere with running water and a roof that didn't weep." Clement spoke before Nora could. "Awfully generous, Mercer. Property you've called worthless for decades, suddenly worth 25,000? Stanhope's smile tightened by a fraction. No one without training would notice. Nora noticed. "The land's still useless for farming, of course, but my company needs access corridors to our eastern quarry operations. Location has value even when soil doesn't." The explanation was smooth, reasonable, practiced, but as Stanhope delivered it, his gaze drifted just for a heartbeat toward the eastern section of the property, the same direction as the limestone outcropping, the same area Odette Hargrove had circled in red ink and labeled Kimberlite. Nora felt the brass loop pressing against her thigh through the fabric of her jeans. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Stanhope, but this is our home now. We're not interested in selling." Something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation performed in real time, visible only to someone watching for it. "As you wish. But if you change your mind, and many do once they understand what they're up against, my offer stands for 2 weeks. After that, well." He spread his hands in a gesture of philosophical resignation. "Property values fluctuate." The veiled threat didn't bother Nora. She'd survived 11 years of Dalton's threats, most of them delivered with more subtlety and in closer quarters. What bothered her was the glance, that involuntary half-second look toward the eastern field, toward the exact coordinates of Odette's discovery. Mercer Stanhope wasn't interested in access roads. He knew, or suspected, or had known all along, had known since before Nora was born, since the 1970s, since a woman scientist named Odette Hargrove had stood in this same hollow and tried to tell the world what lay beneath its supposedly cursed soil. After Stanhope's Range Rover disappeared down the driveway, Clement released a breath that seemed to have been building pressure for 40 years. "Be careful with that one. He doesn't make offers out of kindness. You worked for him." A statement, not a question. Clement nodded. His gaze had gone somewhere far away and a long time ago. 20 years. Started in the quarries. Worked my way up to operations manager. Saw things I shouldn't have tolerated. When I raised concerns, I found myself retired early with a settlement and a confidentiality agreement. What does he want with this land? The question hung between them. Clement weighed it visibly, his jaw working as if the words he was considering had physical mass and shape. Odette Hargrove made certain claims back in the 70s, claims that were publicly ridiculed but privately investigated. That's all I can say. It was enough. The evening settled over the hollow like a held breath. Clement departed with promises to return at dawn with tarps and tools. Faye's casserole chicken and dumplings, still warm, became the best meal any of them had eaten in weeks, served on paper plates at the oak table that Nora had cleared of plaster and wiped clean with water heated on the newly connected propane stove. Silas ate with appetite for the first time in days. Mr. Clement is nice. He didn't look at us like we were sad. Beckett scraped his plate clean. Mom, the CPS lady, what happens if we can't fix everything in 30 days? Nora set down her fork. She met her son's eyes, those old soul eyes that had seen too much rearranging and not enough staying, and spoke with a conviction she was still in the process of building. That is not going to happen. We have this land, we have each other, and we have clues that the woman who lived here before us left behind, clues that might change everything. After dinner, after the boys drifted into exhausted sleep on either side of her in the master bedroom, Nora slipped downstairs with the flashlight and descended again into Odette's laboratory. She spent hours there reading by flashlight, piecing together fragments of a scientific life that had been erased from public record. Odette Hargrove had not been an amateur. Her methodology was rigorous, her documentation was meticulous, and her conclusion that the kimberlite pipe formation existed beneath the eastern section of the property, potentially containing commercially viable diamond deposits, was supported by enough data to make Nora's trained mind take it very, very seriously. A notation in the margin of one survey map, Stanhope offered 15,000. Insulting, he knows. 1978, the last date on any document in the cellar. After that, nothing. As if Odette had been mid-sentence when someone pressed the mute button on her entire existence. A thunderous crash from upstairs shattered the silence. Silas screamed. Nora took the cellar stairs 3 at a time and burst into the master bedroom to find water pouring through a gaping wound in the ceiling. A section of plaster the size of a kitchen table had given way, missing the bed, missing her children by less than 2 feet. Rain drove through the opening as if the sky itself were trying to flush them out of the hollow. She moved the boys to the living room, positioned every potpan and bucket she could find beneath the multiplying leaks. The house groaned around them, surrendering to the storm with the exhausted compliance of something that had been holding on too long and was finally letting go. Silas coughed in his sleep. The wet rattle in his chest had deepened. Nora sat on the floor beside the couch where her sons lay tangled together under a sleeping bag, and she let herself consider it. $25,000, an apartment with functioning heat, a pharmacy within walking distance, the end of this particular impossible fight. She reached into her pocket and closed her fingers around the brass loop, Odette's loop, the instrument of a woman who had looked closer when everyone told her to look away, a woman who had been right about what lay beneath this land and had been destroyed for it. The rain hammered the roof. Water dripped into pots. Silas coughed. Beckett's arm tightened around his brother in sleep. Nora held the loop up to the camping lantern's glow. Through its lens, the water drops falling from the ceiling became spheres of captured light, each one containing a tiny inverted image of the room the sleeping boys, the damaged ceiling, the woman sitting on the floor refusing to leave. She lowered the loop, slipped it back into her pocket, and began very quietly to make a list of what needed to happen first. Dawn arrived without permission, pale and cold, pressing through the grimy windows of the living room, where Nora had spent the remaining hours of the night, cataloguing damage and calculating costs in a notebook already running out of pages. The list she'd begun on the floor beside her sleeping sons had grown into 3 columns: urgent, critical, impossible, and the impossible column was the longest by a factor she didn't want to count. Clement's truck appeared at 7:15, its headlights cutting through fog, so thick the hollow looked like it had been packed in gauze overnight. He wasn't alone. Fay Driscoll rode beside him, a woman built for purpose, short, broad-shouldered, with hands that suggested she'd spent more of her 68 years working than not. She carried a basket that smelled of biscuits and coffee and the particular mercy of someone who understands that food is the first language of rescue. Behind Clement's truck, a flatbed trailer carrying a generator, a stack of blue tarps, and enough lumber to suggest he'd been planning this trip before the ceiling collapsed. Fay took one look at the interior of the farmhouse and embraced Nora without preamble. No questions, no assessment, just arms and warmth and the kind of competence that communicates itself through touch. Then she set the basket on the porch and began organizing the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had fed crews through harvests and blizzards and every mundane catastrophe the mountains could produce. Clement unloaded in silence. When Beckett appeared on the porch, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, the old man handed him a hammer without ceremony. "You know how to use this?" Beckett weighed it in his hand. "I've hammered nails before. Hammering nails and hammering nails right are different conversations. Come on." The morning became an education in applied survival. Clement worked the roof methodically, cutting damaged sections, laying tar paper, securing tarps, where permanent repair wasn't yet possible. Beckett shadowed him, absorbing instruction with the focused gravity of a boy who understood that learning this mattered in ways that long division did not. Silas, limited by his breathing, was assigned supply duty, fetching tools, holding boards, providing water from the jugs Fay had brought. Nora split herself between assisting Clement and addressing the violation list with whatever materials were available. She rehung 3 cabinet doors using hinges salvaged from a shed behind the barn. She swept plaster from every floor. She tested every outlet with a voltage detector Clement produced from his toolbox, marking the dead ones with strips of electrical tape and the live ones with a relief she tried not to show. By noon the house was at least defensible. The roof wouldn't leak unless the rain came sideways again. The kitchen was clean enough to cook in. 2 of the 4 bedrooms were habitable, if you defined habitable loosely enough. "What about water?" Nora asked during a break. They sat on the porch eating Faye's biscuits with honey from a jar that had no label, just a year 2019 written on the lid in marker. Clement's face rearranged itself into the expression of a man about to deliver news he wished he didn't have. "Checked the well house this morning while you were inside. Pumps completely gone, mechanical seals dissolved, but that's not your biggest problem." He paused. "Well, shafts collapsed about 30 feet down, cave-in. You can see it if you lower a light. Karst ground does that, eats itself from underneath. A new well, deep one, 200 feet minimum if you want to hit anything reliable in this geology. Shallow wells in Greenbrier County have been failing for 3 years running. Droughts got everyone hurting." The cost he described, 10,000 at minimum, likely more existed in a universe of money Nora no longer inhabited. She felt the brass loop in her pocket and thought of Odette's maps. The aquifer at 230 feet, the clay cap, the data that said water was there if you could reach it. "There's someone who might help." Clement spoke carefully, as if each word had to pass inspection before leaving his mouth. "Rowan Tallis, independent driller, lives over in Ronseverte. Good reputation, honest, and he's got history with this property that might incline him to take an interest." Nora caught the phrasing. History with this property, not with the county, not with the geology, with this specific piece of ground. "What kind of history?" Clement examined his biscuit as if it contained the answer. He knew Odette Hargrove, believed in her work when the rest of the county thought she was touched. "That's his story to tell, not mine. But I'd call him if I were you." She called that evening from the porch, using the last reliable bars of cell signal before the hollow swallowed the frequency entirely. The number Clement provided rang 3 times. "Tool is drilling." The voice was gravel and patience. Nora introduced herself, mentioned the property, mentioned Odette's name, and waited through a silence long enough to contain weather. "I remember Odette Hargrove." Each word carried the weight of something carried a long distance without being set down. She got laughed out of 3 counties for her findings. Brilliant woman, too brilliant for people who needed her to be wrong. "I've found her research, her laboratory beneath the kitchen, her surveys showing an aquifer at 230 feet beneath a clay barrier." Another silence. Then, "I'll come out tomorrow afternoon. Can't promise anything. But Odette was one of maybe 3 people in my career who understood what I do and why I do it the way I do it. I owe her at least a look." Rowan Tallis arrived the next day at 3 o'clock in a truck that was more equipment than vehicle, drilling rig mounted in the bed tool chests bolted to both flanks, mud splatter, layered so thick on the fenders it had become a geological record of its own. The man matched his machine, 64 years old, 6 feet and change shoulders, built by decades of physical argument with the Earth's crust. His face had the permanent tan of someone who worked outdoors in all seasons, and the deep-set eyes of someone who spent most of that time looking down rather than up. He spent 40 minutes in Odette's laboratory without speaking, examining her surveys and seismic data with the methodical focus of a doctor reviewing another physician's chart before surgery. When he emerged, his face revealed nothing. She wasn't wrong about the clay cap. Question is whether modern equipment can punch through clean at that depth without the whole shaft collapsing in karst like this. He surveyed the property, gaze settling on the eastern field. Where she marked the anomaly, that's where you'd want to drill. Best chance of hitting the aquifer where it's thickest based on her readings. What would it cost? He told her. The number landed like a physical blow. There's another option. Rowan spoke without inflection, presenting facts rather than selling a proposition. I drill on contingency, hit water, you pay reduced cost over 3 years, miss I eat the expense. Why would you take that risk for a stranger? He looked at her directly for the first time. Odette Hargrove was my professor at West Virginia University. Fall semester 1979. Only class I ever took where the teacher understood that the earth doesn't care about your theories, it only cares about whether you're willing to listen. She disappeared before spring term. Nobody explained why. I've spent 40 years wondering what she found out here that was important enough to cost her everything. His jaw tightened. Besides, whatever Mercer Stanhope wants, I'm generally inclined to see he doesn't get. They shook hands. He would return the following morning with the full rig. Word traveled through the hollow, and beyond it the way information moves in rural communities, not through networks or notifications, but through the ancient infrastructure of conversation, observation, and the irresistible human need to know what's happening on the neighboring ridge. By the time Rowan's drilling rig rumbled up the driveway, at 8 the next morning, a small audience had gathered at respectful distance. 2 elderly couples Nora didn't recognize. The pastor from the Methodist church in town, a lean man with watchful eyes who'd heard about the new family from Fay. A woman who introduced herself as the county extension agent and seemed primarily interested in whether Nora intended to farm the cleared acreage. Folks are curious, Fay explained, distributing coffee from a thermos the size of a small artillery shell. The Hargrove place has a reputation. Some are hoping you succeed. Some, she adjusted a sugar packet with unnecessary precision. Some remember what happened to the last woman who tried. The drilling began with a sound that scattered every bird within a quarter mile and brought both boys running from the barn, where they'd been inventorying tools with Clement. Rowan operated the rig with the economical movements of someone who had performed this particular negotiation with the earth thousands of times adjusting pressure, reading vibration, interpreting the feedback the drill transmitted through the steel column like a pulse through a stethoscope. 50 feet, limestone, porous, fractured, typical karst. Rowan extracted samples and examined them without comment. 100 feet, more limestone banded with layers of chert and shale that came up on the bit in ribbons of gray and rust. 150 feet, dense clay, blue-gray, nearly impermeable, arriving on the drill stem in heavy clots that Rowan broke apart with his fingers, rubbing the material between thumb and forefinger the way a sommelier tests a cork. "This is your cap," he told Nora, holding up a clay sample, "like a lid on a jar. Whatever's underneath has been sealed for a very long time." He changed drill bits. The new one, diamond-tipped, catching the afternoon light with a cold precision that seemed almost surgical, cost more than Nora's car. Rowan handled it with the reverence of someone installing a vital organ. The spectators murmured. Bets were placed in the coded language of people who gamble on outcomes they can observe but not control. Nora caught fragments carried on the breeze. Waste of money, same thing Hargrove tried. Curse doesn't care about fancy equipment. 200 feet, still clay. Rowan's face revealed nothing, but his adjustments to the drill became more frequent, more precise, the movements of a man approaching a boundary he wasn't certain existed. The neighbors began drifting away as shadows lengthened. Their departure carried the particular weight of people who had come to witness confirmation of what they already believed, that the hollow took whatever you offered it and gave nothing back. 228 feet. The drill dropped. Not gradually, not incrementally. It dropped 3 inches of sudden absence where resistance had been, as if the earth had simply decided to stop arguing. Rowan killed the power instantly. His hands moved to manual controls with the speed of a man who had learned through decades of practice that the difference between discovery and disaster is measured in seconds of reaction time. He extracted the drill stem slowly, examined the material on the bit, looked up at Nora with an expression that had rearranged itself from professional neutrality into something she could only describe as satisfied certainty. "Got your clay barrier broken through. Underneath," he indicated a different substance clinging to the steel, darker, fatter, granular. "Saturated limestone. Good sign." He re-engaged the drill with heightened caution. 230 feet. Minimal resistance. He extracted the stem again, inserted casing pipe to protect the new shaft, and prepared the test pump with movements that had become, over the course of the afternoon, a kind of ceremony, each step performed with the deliberate attention of someone who understood that what happened next would matter for a long time. The pump motor coughed, caught, whirred. Silence. Mechanical noise without result. Nora's fingernails pressed crescents into her palms, then a sound from deep in the earth. Not a gurgle, not a trickle, a rushing, gathering force that announced itself the way a train announces itself. Before it rounds the bend, you hear it in the rails before you see it on the track. Water exploded from the test pipe in a crystalline arc that shot 20 feet into the October air before Rowan could adjust the flow valve. Pure water, clean water, pressurized by centuries of accumulation beneath the impermeable clay, erupting now with the force of something that had been waiting to be released since before anyone alive had been born. The remaining spectators stood transfixed. Afternoon sunlight hit the spray and shattered into a rainbow that hung over the eastern field like a bridge between what had been and what might yet be. Silas broke the silence, not with words but with laughter, the startled, helpless laughter of a child witnessing something that exceeded his framework for what was possible. Beckett stood very still, watching the water arc and fall, his face working through calculations that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with what the word home might actually mean. Spontaneous applause from the remaining neighbors. The pastor bowed his head in what might have been prayer or simply acknowledgement that some moments demand more than commentary. Rowan let the water run, collecting samples in glass jars. As the initial eruption stabilized into a steady, magnificent stream, something caught Nora's eye. Glints in the muddy slurry washing up around the drill pipe, light catching on particles that were not sand, not quartz, not any of the ordinary minerals a karst system might produce. Silas spotted them before she could move. He was already at the edge of the muddy pool, already reaching in with the unself-conscious confidence of a boy for whom mud is not an obstacle, but an invitation. "Mom, look! Sparkly rocks!" He held up his palm. 5 small stones, mud-coated but unmistakable in how they caught the light, not reflecting it like glass, but refracting it, bending it, breaking it into component wavelengths, the way only one mineral on Earth consistently does. Rowan was beside them in 3 strides. He crouched, took 1 stone from Silas's palm, and wiped it clean on his shirt with hands that had suddenly stopped being steady. When he spoke, his voice was pitched for Nora's ears alone. "That's not quartz." He held the stone to the light, rotating it slowly. "That's industrial-grade diamond, small but real." He indicated another of Silas's finds, slightly larger, catching the sun with a clarity that seemed almost aggressive. And this one might be gem quality. Nora's mind connected the data points with the speed of a system trained for exactly this kind of synthesis. Odette's surveys, the Kimberlite notation, Stanhope's interest, the offers, the curse that had kept everyone else away for 40 years. Odette Hargrove had not been delusional. She had discovered a diamond pipe, a volcanic formation that acts as an elevator shaft, delivering diamonds from 100 miles beneath the Earth's crust to within reach of anyone willing to look closely enough. The neighbors, still celebrating the water, remained oblivious. Rowan quietly helped Silas collect the remaining stones, transferring them to a sample jar that he handed to Nora with a look that required no translation. "This changes everything, and everyone who wants what you have just became more dangerous." The jar went into her jacket pocket opposite the brass loop. Two weights now, two secrets. One ancient one still warm from her son's hand. That evening, after Rowan departed with promises to return for permanent pump installation, after the neighbors dispersed, carrying news of the water strike through the valley, after Fay had fed everyone and Clement had secured the last tarp on the roof, Nora sat with the boys on the porch steps, watching the sky deepen from amber to violet above the ridgeline. Silas leaned against her shoulder. His breathing was easier today, whether from the clean water, the reduced dust after Fay's cleaning campaign, or simply the physiological effect of hope, Nora couldn't say. She'd take it regardless. Mom, Beckett watching the first stars appear. Are we going to be okay? We found water today, on land where everyone said there wasn't any. That's not nothing. That's not what I asked. She looked at her older son, older by 9 minutes, older by a lifetime of watching, calculating, preparing for outcomes he shouldn't have to anticipate. Yeah, Beck, we're going to be okay. 3 days of progress followed. The well system became permanent pump pressure tank filtration unit, each component installed by Rowan with Beckett serving as apprentice and Silas providing running commentary on the process from a safe distance. Hot water reached the kitchen sink on day 2. The bathroom fixtures, ancient but functional, delivered their first reliable flow on day 3. Nora stood at the kitchen faucet, watching clean water pour from a tap in a house that hadn't had running water in 30 years, and felt something shift in her chest, a tectonic plate of emotion moving from one position to another, not dramatically, but permanently. Clement brought his grandsons, 2 teenagers, who attacked the remaining roof damage with the competitive energy of boys who'd been promised gas money and bragging rights. The porch railings went up straight and solid. A licensed electrician from Alderson, contacted through Fay's church network, inspected and upgraded the wiring across 2 long days, producing a signed certification that Nora filed immediately with the county. Community support arrived in forms both expected and strange. A box of canned goods on the porch one morning, no note. A used but serviceable winter coat in Silas's size hung on the mailbox post. A cord of firewood split and stacked beside the barn by someone who had come and gone before dawn. On the 4th morning, Nora drove 40 miles east to Briarwood with the diamond samples secured in her jacket and the brass loop riding beside them. Dr. Ansel Pembroke, retired from Tiffany's gemological department, now occupying a craftsman bungalow whose garden suggested a man who had transferred his precision from stones to soil, worked for 2 hours with equipment Nora recognized from university labs, microscopes, spectrometers, lighting systems calibrated to reveal what casual observation conceals. His conclusion arrived without drama. Genuine diamonds, mostly industrial grade, suitable for drill bits technical applications, worth several thousand collectively. But these 3, he isolated the largest specimens under a focused beam, gem quality, excellent clarity, small but valuable, 15 to 20,000 after cutting and certification. He asked where she'd found them. She told him enough. He nodded with the knowing patience of a man who understood that some answers require protection more than disclosure. Kimberlite pipe, he confirmed, examining the geological photographs she'd brought. Volcanic conduit. Millions of years old. Your predecessor wasn't wrong, and she wasn't crazy. She was simply ahead of the people who had the power to validate her. He returned the samples with a written assessment and a warning. The real value isn't in these surface specimens. It's in what lies below. A productive kimberlite pipe could contain deposits worth conservatively tens of millions. That's what makes your situation dangerous, as well as fortunate. Nora returned to the farm, carrying the assessment like a weapon she hadn't yet learned to aim. Enough value to address immediate needs, enough potential to attract the attention of people with more resources and fewer scruples. Through Clement's contacts, she connected with Josephine Calder Josie, a mineral rights attorney operating from a converted Victorian in Hinton, 58 silver-streaked hair in a practical braid voice like gravel polished by river water. She reviewed Pembroke's assessment alongside Odette's research materials with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of case. You need to file mineral rights documentation with the state immediately. Surface rights and subsurface rights are separate claims in West Virginia, and without proper filing, you're vulnerable to challenges from anyone who can afford a better lawyer than you, which in Greenbrier County means Mercer Stanhope. Josie arranged a discreet sale of several industrial-grade stones through established channels enough to cover Silas's prescription critical repair materials and Josie's own retainer. The transaction was documented meticulously, establishing legal precedent for Nora's right to profit from minerals found on her property. The money arrived the same day as the custody hearing papers. A deputy appeared at the end of the driveway with documents requiring Nora's signature. Dalton was petitioning for emergency temporary custody on grounds of unsafe living conditions. The hearing was scheduled for Tuesday, 5 days away. Nora read the petition on the porch while the boys finished homework at the kitchen table, unaware that the legal system their father had weaponized was preparing to decide whether they could remain in the home they'd helped rebuild with their own hands. Josie Calder notified immediately adjusted strategy with the adaptive efficiency of someone accustomed to fighting on multiple fronts. She would handle the custody hearing personally despite her mineral rights specialization, because the two issues were inseparable. Stanhope's property ambitions and Dalton's custody petition were coordinated pressures applied to the same target. The hearing arrived with October clarity, cold air, hard light, the kind of autumn morning that reveals everything and forgives nothing. Nora dressed the boys in their cleanest clothes. Clement and Fay drove them to the Monroe County Courthouse, both dressed in Sunday attire that communicated respectability and solidarity in equal measure. In the courthouse hallway, the opposition assembled. Dalton with his attorney, Philip Canwell, a Charleston divorce specialist whose reputation preceded him like a cold front. And seated on a bench nearby, engaged in conversation with Vivian Tate from CPS, was Mercer Stanhope. His presence wasn't legally required. Its purpose was atmospheric, a reminder of the resources aligned against her. The hearing proceeded along predictable lines. Canwell constructed a narrative of maternal recklessness photographs from the early days at the farm CPS documentation, the deputy's inspection report. Each image was presented as evidence of character rather than circumstance, as if the leaking roof and broken windows were symptoms of Nora's judgment rather than her poverty. Josie's counter-narrative deployed the evidence of transformation. Recent photographs showing repaired roof functioning utilities, secure windows, professional certifications from the electrician, school registration documents, letters from Faye, from Clement, from the pastor neighbors, testifying to competence and determination they'd witnessed firsthand. The boy spoke privately with Judge Watson in chambers. 15 minutes that stretched across geological time. When they emerged, Silas whispered to Nora with radiant certainty, "I told him about helping with the water pump." Watson's ruling split the difference with judicial precision. Primary physical custody remained with Nora, conditional upon continued compliance with county housing standards and regular inspections. Dalton received expanded visitation. Co-parenting counseling was mandated. Review in 90 days. Nora absorbed the verdict with the controlled stillness of someone who has braced for a blow that landed lighter than expected, but still landed. Conditional custody meant ongoing vulnerability. Any lapse, any failed inspection, any report from Vivian Tate, any ammunition Dalton could manufacture or Stanhope could engineer could reopen the question. As they filed out of the courtroom, Nora caught Stanhope's expression. Not defeat, recalibration, the slight narrowing of eyes that accompanies a revised timeline, rather than an abandoned objective. 2 days later, the revised strategy arrived. A sheriff's deputy delivered a temporary restraining order prohibiting any mining, excavation, or mineral extraction activities on the Hargrove property, effective immediately. Violations punishable by fines exceeding anything Nora could pay. The order cited potential environmental concerns requiring assessment. The plaintiff, Stanhope Coal and Mineral, claiming their adjacent operations could be compromised by unregulated excavation on neighboring land. The same afternoon, a second document arrived from the county tax assessor's office, property reassessment based on mineral potential, new valuation 3,000% above the previous assessment, tax bill due within 30 days. Non-payment penalties, including property seizure. Nora read both documents at the kitchen table, while the boys worked on math problems 3 feet away, their pencils scratching against paper with the innocent industry of children who did not yet understand that the numbers threatening their home were larger than anything in their workbooks. Josie Calder's voice on the phone carried controlled fury. "This is textbook. Environmental restraining order freezes your ability to document the deposit's value. Tax reassessment creates financial pressure you can't sustain. Together, they're designed to force a sale before you can establish what the property is actually worth." His father used the identical playbook against Odette Hargrove in 1978. The historical parallel struck Nora with physical force. 40 years apart, two women, same hollow, same tactics, deployed by the same family. Odette had broken under the pressure, sold for a fraction of value, disappeared, her research buried so thoroughly it took 4 decades to resurface. Josie filed challenges to both the restraining order and the tax reassessment, but the timeline for resolution stretched into months. Months during which penalties accumulated, months during which the diamond deposit remained legally untouchable, its value theoretical rather than demonstrated, its potential locked beneath bureaucratic barriers as impenetrable as the clay cap Rowan had drilled through. That evening, Clement stopped by after his own chores were finished. He found Nora on the porch, the restraining order and the tax notice spread before her, the brass loop sitting on top of them like a paperweight holding down documents that wanted to fly away and take everything with them. She told him about the tax reassessment. She told him about the restraining order. She told him about Josie's assessment that the tactics were identical to those used against Odette. Clement listened without interrupting. When she finished, the silence between them filled with cricket song and the distant sound of water running through the new pipe's water that existed because someone had been willing to drill past the point where reasonable people stop. Then the old man spoke, and his voice carried a weight she hadn't heard before, not the careful measured tone of a neighbor helping with roof tarps, something rawer, something that had been sealed beneath its own kind of clay cap for a very long time. "They did this before." His hands resting on his knees had closed into fists so tight the knuckles blanched white against weathered skin. The tax letters, the restraining orders, the inspectors showing up at convenient times. He looked at Nora, and in his eyes she saw something that reconfigured every interaction they'd had since the day he first appeared in her driveway with a casserole and a propane tank. And I watched them do it, every bit of it, because I was the one Mercer's father sent to deliver the messages. The hollow held its breath, the water ran. The boys' voices drifted from inside the house, arguing cheerfully about whose turn it was to wash dishes. Nora's hand found the brass loop on the table, Odette's loop, the instrument of a woman who had been driven from this land by the very man now sitting on her porch, confessing 40 years too late. "Tell me everything," she said. Clement spoke for 40 minutes without stopping. The porch light attracted moths that circled in erratic orbits above their heads, and inside the house the boys had moved from dishes to reading their voices, occasionally carrying through the screen door in fragments that belonged to a world simpler than the one being constructed on the other side of it. The story came out in the order it had been lived, not the order it had been understood. In 1977, Clement was 30 years old, 3 years into his position as operations manager at Stanhope Coal and Mineral. Odette Hargrove had been on the property for 6 years, by then a woman alone, in a hollow running equipment that cost more than most houses in the county, taking measurements that nobody asked for and reaching conclusions nobody wanted to hear. Mercer's father, Wallace Stanhope, he got wind of her findings through a geologist the company kept on retainer, fellow who'd been asked to discredit her research for an academic journal. Instead, he read her data and told Wallace it was sound, that the kimberlite formation was real, that the diamond indicators were consistent with a commercially viable pipe. Clement's voice had flattened into the monotone of someone testifying under oath to facts he wished he could unknow. Wallace didn't want to buy the property at fair value. He wanted it for nothing, wanted the discovery attributed to his own geological team, wanted Odette erased from the record entirely. The campaign had been systematic. Tax reassessments to create financial pressure, calls to academic colleagues questioning her methodology, anonymous complaints to county agencies about her research activities. And when those measures proved insufficient, when Odette held on with the stubbornness of someone who understood that truth doesn't stop being true just because powerful people find it inconvenient, Wallace escalated. He sent me out here 3 times. First time I delivered a letter, legal threats. Second time I was told to photograph her equipment and notes through the windows for the company's lawyers. Clement's fists had not unclenched. Third time I came at night with a crowbar. The word landed on the porch like something dropped from height. I broke her seismograph, smashed sample containers, pried open her filing cabinet, and took every document I could carry. Drove it straight to Wallace's office at 2 in the morning. He was waiting, had coffee ready, thanked me like I'd done something worth thanking. Nora sat motionless. The loop in her hand had grown warm from her grip. She thought of the laboratory beneath the kitchen, its meticulous organization, its preserved equipment, its maps still marked in red ink. And she understood now that what she'd found was not the original lab, but its reconstruction. Odette had rebuilt after the break-in, had continued working even after the violation, had ultimately hidden her second laboratory beneath the floor, invisible to anyone who came with a crowbar in the dark. Why are you telling me this now? Clement looked at her with eyes that held 4 decades of compound interest on a debt he'd never attempted to pay. Because they're doing it again, same family, same tactics, same hollow, and this time I'm not carrying anyone's crowbar. The confession changed the geometry of everything. Clement wasn't simply a kind neighbor who'd shown up with casserole and tarps. He was a man performing penance through acts of carpentry and decency, trying to rebuild something he'd helped destroy before he fully understood what it was. His knowledge of Stanhope's methods, the specific pressure points, the bureaucratic levers the timeline of escalation was intelligence gathered from inside the machine that had crushed Odette. Nora called Josie Calder the next morning. The attorney listened to Clement's account with the focused stillness of someone watching puzzle pieces arrange themselves into a picture she'd suspected but couldn't prove. His testimony establishes a pattern of predatory behavior spanning 2 generations. That's not just relevant to your mineral rights case, it potentially constitutes evidence of ongoing corrupt practices involving county officials. But we need more than one man's memory. We need Odette's original documentation. The material Wallace confiscated, or copies of it, something that corroborates the historical pattern independently. The search for Odette's legacy consumed the following week. Nora worked 3 fronts simultaneously. Josie pursued legal databases and property records. Clement mined his memory for names and dates that might produce leads. And Faye mobilized the most powerful intelligence network in rural America, church women, with long memories and strong opinions about justice. It was Faye who found the thread. Through the Methodist Women's Fellowship National Directory, she connected with a retired minister in Burlington, Vermont, who remembered a Margaret Sullivan, an Odette. Odette something, a geologist, former parishioner in the early 1980s, had mentioned a sister in southern Vermont. The sister was dead, but the sister's daughter was not. Willa Hargrove Callahan operated a natural history bookshop in Brattleboro, Vermont. When Nora called and identified herself as the current owner of the Greenbrier County property, the silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough for Nora to hear the woman's breathing change from guarded to something that sounded unmistakably like relief. "I've been waiting for this call for 9 years." Willa's voice was steady but charged. Since Aunt Odette died, she always said someone would eventually find the lab. She designed it to survive, sealed the entrance, waterproofed the walls, wrapped everything in plastic. She said the land would choose who found it. Odette had died in 2017 at a senior living facility in Vermont. 83 years old, lucid until the end. And in her final months, she had done something that transformed her from historical victim to active participant in a justice she would not live to see. She made a video, sat in front of a camera for 4 hours and told everything, every detail of what she found, what Wallace Stanhope did, who was involved, what documents existed, and where copies were kept. She called it her testimony, said it was for the woman who would come after her. Nora gripped the phone so hard her fingers ached. She said woman. She was very specific. She said a woman would find the lab because a woman would be the only one desperate enough to buy land that men had declared worthless. And she said that woman would need proof that couldn't be dismissed the way her own voice had been dismissed in 1978. Willa arrived 4 days later, driving 12 hours from Vermont with the back seat of her station wagon loaded with 3 archive boxes and a sealed video cassette that had been professionally transferred to digital format by a Brattleboro media company the previous year. She was 55 with Odette's jawline and a directness that suggested genetic stubbornness, reinforced by decades of protective anger on her aunt's behalf. They watched the video in Odette's laboratory. It seemed right, the only room in the house where the woman's presence still occupied physical space. Nora positioned the laptop on the drafting table and Willa pressed play, and Odette Hargrove spoke from beyond death with a clarity that filled the underground room like groundwater filling a well. She was filmed sitting in a wheelchair beside a window through which Vermont snow was falling. Her face was lined but alert, her eyes carrying the particular sharpness of someone who has spent a lifetime looking at things others preferred not to see. She wore a simple blue sweater, her hands resting on a manila folder in her lap were steady. My name is Odette Hargrove. I hold a doctorate in geological sciences from West Virginia University. From 1971 to 1978, I conducted independent research on a 43-acre property in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. During that period, I identified and documented a kimberlite pipe formation containing commercially significant diamond indicators. My findings were systematically suppressed through coordinated action by Wallace Stanhope of Stanhope Coal and Mineral, with the complicity of county tax authorities, the State Geological Survey Office, and at least 2 academic reviewers who accepted compensation to discredit my methodology. The testimony continued for 3 hours and 47 minutes. Odette narrated each stage of discovery and each corresponding stage of suppression with the precision of a scientist presenting data. Dates, names, document numbers, specific conversations reproduced with the recall of someone who had replayed them nightly for 40 years. She described the break in the smashed seismograph, the stolen files, and named Clement Driscoll as the man Wallace had sent. No anger in the identification, just fact delivered with the same neutrality she applied to soil composition data. She described rebuilding her lab in secret beneath the kitchen floor, working at night, collecting new samples, reaching the same conclusions with new data because the earth doesn't change its testimony based on who's listening. And she described the final pressure Wallace's attorney delivering an ultimatum in person: sell at the offered price or face criminal prosecution for filing fraudulent mineral claims. A fabricated charge, but one that would require legal defense she couldn't afford and would destroy whatever remained of her professional credibility. I sold, not because I believed I was wrong, but because I understood that being right at that moment, in that place, against that family, would cost me more than the land was worth to me as a living woman. The diamonds would wait. Stone is patient. I was not patient. I was afraid. And I have carried that fear as a companion for 40 years. She paused, looked directly into the camera. And in that look, Nora recognized something she had felt on the porch with the restraining order and the tax notice spread before her, the specific exhaustion of a woman who has been told that what she knows is less real than what a powerful man prefers to believe. To whoever finds my laboratory, the evidence is in the boxes my niece Willa is keeping. Duplicates of everything Wallace took. I made copies the week before the break-in, because I'm a scientist and scientists make copies. The originals of my correspondence with Wallace's attorney are there. The original tax reassessment documents showing coordination with his office are there. Geological survey data sufficient to establish the kimberlite formation independently of any new excavation is there. Use it. Not for the money, though the money will be considerable, but because the truth about that land deserves to exist in daylight after 40 years underground. The video ended. The laboratory was silent, except for the faint hum of the well pump operating one floor above, water flowing through pipes because a woman's research dismissed and buried had been proven right by another woman 40 years later. Willa opened the archive boxes. Inside meticulously organized folders containing duplicates of Odette's geological surveys, correspondence with Wallace Stanhope's legal team, internal Stanhope Company, memos obtained through means Odette did not explain, and copies of the fraudulent academic reviews commissioned to discredit her findings. Every document, dated, cross-referenced, and indexed with the care of someone who understood that evidence like diamonds only has value when it can be authenticated. Josie Calder arrived within 2 hours of Nora's call. She spent the evening reviewing the archive with the accelerating energy of an attorney who has just been handed the case she spent her career preparing to argue. By midnight, she had identified 17 separate instances of actionable misconduct spanning both generations of Stanhope leadership, enough to support not just Nora's mineral rights claim, but a broader investigation into systematic corruption of county regulatory processes. The restraining order was issued by a judge who received campaign contributions from Stanhope Coal, Josie noted, flagging a document. The tax reassessment was processed by an assessor whose brother-in-law manages Stanhope's Eastern Quarry operations. The CPS referral that started all of this was routed through a caseworker who previously worked in Stanhope's Human Resources Department. She looked up from the papers. This isn't a property dispute. It's a 40-year pattern of institutional corruption, and your case is the thread that unravels it. Josie filed simultaneously with state authorities and the Federal District Court mineral rights documentation supported by Odette's original research, a formal complaint alleging corruption of county officials, and a motion to vacate the restraining order based on evidence that it had been obtained through fraudulent environmental claims. Clement Driscoll provided a sworn affidavit corroborating Odette's testimony, filling in details from the operational side that matched her account with the precision of 2 puzzle pieces cut from the same image. The institutional response, when it came, arrived with the weight and momentum of something that had been leaning for a long time and finally found sufficient reason to fall. The State Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Stanhope Coal and Minerals' relationship with Greenbrier County regulatory agencies. The restraining order was vacated within 72 hours, the issuing judge recusing himself from all matters involving the Hargrove property. The tax reassessment was reversed, pending independent review with the county assessor placed on administrative leave. Mercer Stanhope's final visit to the farm came on a Thursday afternoon 3 weeks after the video testimony had been filed with the court. His Range Rover pulled into the driveway for the last time, but the man who emerged bore little resemblance to the figure who had offered $25,000 with the air of a benefactor. His suit was the same quality, his posture was the same height. But something behind his eyes had changed, the particular dimming that occurs when someone accustomed to controlling outcomes realizes that the current outcome has escaped their control entirely. Nora met him on the porch. Josie Calder stood beside her. Clement Driscoll sat in a chair near the door, his presence carrying a meaning Stanhope could not have missed. The man who had once been his family's instrument, now positioned as witness against them. Stanhope spoke for less than 2 minutes. His attorney had advised against coming. He had come anyway because men like Mercer Stanhope need to see for themselves the moment when the architecture of assumed superiority encounters a foundation it cannot crack. He did not make another offer. He did not reference the property or the diamonds or the pending investigation. He said only that his family had served Greenbrier County for 3 generations, and that he regretted any misunderstandings that might have occurred during the transition of property ownership. Josie responded with 4 words, "We'll see you in court." The Range Rover departed. It did not return. In the weeks that followed, Nora signed an agreement with a reputable mining consortium, not Stanhope, not any entity connected to his network, but a Colorado-based company specializing in ethical gemstone extraction. The terms preserved her ownership of the land and provided royalty percentages that Josie negotiated with the cheerful ruthlessness of someone who had waited a long time to set a fair price for something the market had systematically undervalued. The preliminary geological survey conducted by the consortium's independent team confirmed what Odette had documented and what Nora had begun to prove: a kimberlite pipe formation of significant commercial potential. Conservative estimates placed the deposit's value above $100 million. The actual figure would take years of careful extraction to determine, but the floor, the minimum, was enough to transform the conversation about what 43 acres of cursed land in a West Virginia hollow were worth. Enough to ensure that Silas would never run out of medication again. Enough to ensure that Beckett would never have to calculate whether his family could afford to stay. Enough to establish in perpetuity that Odette Hargrove had been right about every single thing the world had told her she was wrong about. Dalton's custody petition was withdrawn on a Tuesday morning, communicated through his attorney with no personal contact. The co-parenting counseling continued. Nora insisted on it, but the dynamic had shifted in ways that formal legal proceedings could not have accomplished. Dalton arrived for his visitation weekends in a sedan rather than a statement. He asked the boys about school. He complimented the porch railings. He did not mention property values or geological fantasies or the word dirt. November settled over the hollow with the slow commitment of a season that has no intention of leaving quickly. The oaks released their leaves in cascading waves of copper and rust, carpeting the fields in colors so saturated they looked artificial. Morning fog filled the hollow like milk in a bowl burning off by 10 to reveal the ridge lines, sharp against skies of depthless blue. The farmhouse, imperfect but sound, held its warmth through nights that dropped below freezing. The wood stove Clement had helped restore radiating heat through rooms that smelled of oak smoke and the particular contentment of spaces that have been earned rather than purchased. On a Saturday in late November, Nora hosted a gathering that had no formal name or occasion. Faye organized food. Clement handled logistics. Rowan Tallis brought a case of cider from an orchard near Ronsverte. Josie Calder arrived with Willa Hargrove Callahan, who had driven down from Vermont to see for the first time the property her aunt had loved and lost, and ultimately bequeathed not through legal inheritance, but through the more durable mechanism of hidden truth. Waiting for the right hands, neighbors came, the pastor, the electrician who'd certified the wiring, the anonymous donors of firewood and canned goods, and a winter coat in a 10-year-old's size, now revealed by the casual self-consciousness of people who hadn't expected their kindness to be traced back to them. Harold and Mabel Kinney, who'd left the cord of wood. June Osborne, who'd hung the coat on the mailbox. Duff Pemberton, no relation to the gemologist who'd driven the canned goods over from his church pantry at 4 in the morning, because he didn't want to make a fuss. They stood in the yard, these people holding plates and cups, talking about weather and cattle prices and the high school football team's playoff chances. And beneath all of it ran the unspoken current of a community acknowledging that something had happened in the hollow that mattered beyond property lines and mineral rights. A woman had been silenced, and another woman had found her voice in the dirt. A family had been broken, and the hollow had helped put it back together with tarps and biscuits and the particular stubbornness of people who show up. Willa stood for a long time at the entrance to Odette's laboratory, not descending, just looking down the stairs into the space her aunt had built in secret and preserved against the day it would be needed. Nora stood beside her. "She would have liked you," Willa said. "She would have liked that you're a geologist. She would have liked that you didn't sell. She saved us, her research, her letter, her loop." Nora touched the brass instrument in her pocket. She hid all of it so carefully, as if she knew. She did know, not who or when, just that the land would outlast the people trying to take it. That's what she always said. Stone is patient. The afternoon light lengthened across the eastern field, the field where the kimberlite pipe ran beneath the surface, like a vein of compressed time carrying diamonds forged 2 billion years ago in conditions of heat and pressure that would destroy anything not strong enough to become something harder than it was before. Silas found Nora at the edge of that field. He'd been running with the other children, the Driscoll grandsons, 2 kids from the Methodist Church youth group, a girl his age from the neighboring farm who decided his shyness was a challenge rather than a barrier. His breathing was easy, the new medication worked, the clean water helped. The mountain air, stripped of the pollutants that had shadowed his lungs in Charleston, had given his body room to perform the simple miracle of unobstructed breathing. "Mom," he tugged her sleeve, "can I see the loop?" She handed it to him. He held it to his eye and aimed it not at the ground, not at stones or soil or anything that might contain value, measurable in dollars, but at a cluster of wild asters growing at the field's margin, purple and white, the last wildflowers of the season, persisting into November through the specific defiance of organisms that bloom when the calendar says they shouldn't. They look different up close. Silas reported, his voice carrying the particular wonder of a child discovering that the world contains more detail than the naked eye can process. There are tiny little lines on each petal, like maps. Nora crouched beside him. Through the loop, the asters revealed their architecture, vein structures, pollen granulae, the microscopic topography of living surfaces, too small to appreciate without magnification, beautiful, ordinary, invisible to anyone not willing to look closer. From the direction of the barn, a rhythmic hammering announced that Beckett was at work on something. Nora walked over Silas, following with the loop still pressed to his eye, examining everything bark leaves his own thumbnail with the systematic curiosity of a boy who has discovered that the most interesting things are not the ones that announce themselves. Beckett stood on a stepladder beside the barn's entrance, securing a new sign he'd made from a piece of cedar planking sanded smooth and lettered with a wood-burning tool Clement had lent him. The letters were uneven, the work of a 10-year-old's careful hand, but legible. Odette's name first. The woman who had been erased from the record, now permanently inscribed at the entrance to the land she had understood better than anyone who came before or after. Nora looked at the sign, looked at her son on the stepladder, his face set in concentration, his hands competent and sure, looked at Silas, who had lowered the loop and was reading the sign with his lips moving slightly, sounding out the syllables of a name he'd learned to respect before he fully understood why. Beck. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "That's exactly right." Beckett climbed down and stood beside her, examining his work with the critical eye of someone who will probably adjust the spacing later, but is satisfied enough for now. Silas handed him the loop. "Look at the letters up close. You can see where the wood burned darker in some spots. It's like each letter has its own fingerprint." Beckett obliged, raising the loop to one eye and leaning toward the sign. For a moment, both boys were absorbed in the microscopic details of something they had made: the grain of the wood, the charred edges of hand-burned letters, the small imperfections that made the sign theirs rather than anyone else's. Nora watched them. Behind her, the sounds of the gathering drifted across the yard. Fay's laughter, Clement's low rumble, the clink of cider glasses, the conversation of people who had decided individually and then collectively that this family belonged to this place, and this place belonged to this family. Above them, the hawk she'd seen on their first day circled the eastern field on a thermal that rose from ground warmed by late autumn sun, riding the invisible architecture of heated air with the confidence of a creature that trusts what it cannot see. Silas crouched and scooped a handful of soil from beside the barn foundation. Dark, rich, alive with the particular biology of ground that has been left alone long enough to remember what it's for. He held it up to the afternoon light, letting it sift through his fingers, and grinned at his mother with an expression that contained no calculation, no strategy, no awareness of mineral rights or tax assessments or the complex machinery of justice that had brought them to this moment. "It's never just dirt, Mom." The soil fell, the light caught it, and for a moment suspended between a boy's hand and the ground that had kept its secrets until the right family came along, each grain carried its own small fire. Not diamonds, not this time, just ordinary earth illuminated by ordinary sun, which was in the end more than enough. If you've ever fought for something everyone else told you to walk away from, a piece of ground, a belief, a version of yourself that the world found inconvenient, you already know what Nora knows now. The valuable thing was never what lay beneath the surface. It was the willingness to look closer. What's the one thing in your life that you almost gave up on but didn't? Tell us in the comments. And if this story reminded you of someone who needs to hear it, share it with them. Sometimes the right story reaches the right person at exactly the right time. Thank you for staying until the end.